During a crucial company meeting, a new employee accidentally spills hot coffee on an executive, and his reaction stuns everyone. Robert always knew life wasn't easy. Since he was a child, he had learned that nothing would be given to him without effort, without sacrifice. He grew up in a humble home where hard work was the only guarantee of survival. His father, a dedicated worker, spent his days among machines and tools, his hands marked by constant labor. His mother, a tireless seamstress, sewed late into the night, turning fabric into sustenance for the family. In their home, there were no luxuries, only the daily struggle to ensure the basics were never missing. Robert grew up watching his parents sacrifice everything to give him a chance at a better future. He never knew privilege, never had an easy path, but within him was the determination to change his reality. It was this that drove him, that made him persist in the face of difficulties, believing that with effort he could build something different from the past that had shaped him. Now, after so much hard work, he had finally managed to get a job at a large company. It wasn't a high-ranking position, nor did it involve important decisions, but to him, it represented the first step toward growth. His role was simple but required attention, serving coffee during meetings, organizing trays, and ensuring that the executives had everything they needed. A mistake, no matter how small, could cost him the future he had dreamed of. Robert understood the value of that opportunity and knew he couldn't waste it. To him, it wasn't just a trivial task. It was the beginning of something bigger. That's why he did everything to be flawless, to make no slip-ups, to give no one a reason to question his presence there. The first days were tough. Every morning, he felt the weight of anxiety tightening his chest. The corporate environment was intense, filled with hurried steps, serious faces, and people always busy. No one looked at him, no one seemed to notice his presence, but he knew that a single mistake could make him visible for all the wrong reasons. Every detail had to be executed with precision. In that company, failure was not tolerated. His job seemed simple, but it was treacherous. Every cup had to be at the right temperature, every bottle full, every tray positioned with accuracy. A stumble, a slip, and the consequences could be serious. He didn't just want to do it well, he wanted to be flawless. Every day he worked hard to memorize schedules, preferences, routines. Working hard was the bare minimum. He knew that any oversight could cost him not just his job, but also the dream he was beginning to build. The day had dawned with a tense atmosphere. As always, Robert arrived early, ensuring everything was in order before the top-level employees began to arrive. The routine was precise, almost ritualistic. He checked the coffee cart, made sure the cups were aligned, and the sugar and sweeteners were in their proper places. But that morning, everything seemed different. The buzz in the hallways was unusual. The glances carried a subtle worry, and whispers appeared in small groups. Robert sensed that something big was about to happen. It didn't take long for him to understand. This wasn't just any meeting. The company's leaders were gathered to discuss strategic directions that could directly impact the future of the organization. In the break room, while adjusting the final details of the tray, Robert heard the familiar voice of Matthew, one of the assistants from the administrative team. "Today's one of those days, my friend. A wrong step, and it's over," he said, leaning on the counter with an anxious look. Robert paused for a moment and took a deep breath. He already knew that, but hearing it from someone else made the weight of it even more real. "What exactly is at stake?" Robert asked, trying to mask his nervousness. Matthew looked around as if making sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. "It's about the new expansion plan. They say some executives disagree with the projections, and Daniel's in the middle of the discussion. If there's one thing we know, it's that he doesn't take kindly to being contradicted." "Daniel?" Robert repeated, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Yeah, if it were anyone else, fine. But him? That man doesn't have patience for even a minute's delay. Imagine if someone messes up in front of him. Robert nodded slowly, trying to control the growing pressure inside him. Daniel wasn't just respected, he was feared. His presence demanded silence. His voice cut like a blade, and his tolerance for failure was absolutely non-existent. To Robert, it was clear. Any slip-up in front of him could mean the end of his brief journey there. "Well, good luck to you," Matthew said, giving him a pat on the shoulder before leaving. Robert stood there for a few seconds, feeling the temperature of his own body shift between cold and hot. He needed to stay focused. He took a deep breath, grabbed the tray, and with steady hands headed toward the meeting room. As he walked down the hallway, the weight of the moment intensified. The executives were already gathered, and the silence in the room indicated that the conversation was serious. Robert's footsteps lightly echoed as he approached the door. He carefully pushed it open, maintaining his impeccable posture, and entered. The room was large, sophisticated, with a long table where the company leaders were seated. Papers scattered, gazes fixed, tension thick in the air. Daniel was there, sitting at the head of the table. His gaze was cutting, his expression stern. He didn't need to speak to make it clear what kind of presence he had in that room. Robert felt his heart race, but he kept his focus. He balanced the tray with precision and began serving the cups one by one. The strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room, a detail that, in another circumstance, might have been comforting. But here in this room, every movement Robert made had to be meticulously calculated. "We need to review the numbers again," one of the executives said, breaking the tense silence. "Investors won't accept projections without solid backing." Daniel snorted impatiently. "We've gone over this 3 times already. The calculations have been reviewed and they're correct. What more do you need?" The conversation continued, but Robert kept his focus on his task. He had already served most of the executives and was now approaching Daniel. He swallowed hard, feeling cold sweat run down his neck. He adjusted the position of the tray in his hands, making sure it was balanced. His goal was simple: place the cup in front of Daniel without incident. But then, at the exact moment he took a step forward, his foot found a slight bump in the carpet. The impact was subtle, but enough to throw off his hand. And the inevitable happened. The cup slipped from his hand, and the hot liquid spilled across Daniel's immaculate shirt. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The shock rippled through the room like a silent wave. The aroma of coffee now mixed with the suffocating heat of the tension that filled the air. The impact of the accident was immediate. The hot coffee spread quickly over the fine fabric of Daniel's shirt, soaking into the delicate tailoring, staining the impeccable tone of the fabric. For a moment there was only silence, a suffocating silence, absolute, as if the very air in the room had been sucked into the emptiness of the tension forming. All eyes turned to Daniel. None of the executives dared to take a deep breath, move a muscle, or even frown. The weight of the situation was crushing. Daniel, rigid in his chair, looked at his own shirt, as if his outrage were so great that his brain took a moment to process what had just happened. His face, once impassive and severe, slowly transformed into an expression of overwhelming fury. His eyes flashed, his jaw tightened, and a flush of anger spread up his neck. Then suddenly, the explosion came. "Are you kidding me?" Daniel yelled, his voice cutting through the silence of the room like a blade. His chair was shoved back with force as he stood abruptly, glaring at Robert with an expression that bordered on absolute contempt. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Robert felt the ground open beneath his feet. His chest tightened so much he felt as if his heart had stopped. Cold sweat ran down his neck, and his hands trembled by his sides. He tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, unable to produce any coherent sound. "Sir, I'm so sorry," Robert stammered, his voice weak, trembling. "It was an accident. I didn't mean—" accident?" Daniel bellowed, stepping forward. "Do you have any idea how much a shirt like this costs?" He spread his arms, pointing at the damage to his clothes, the coffee still dripping onto the silk fabric. "I bet you don't make enough in a year to pay for this." Robert lowered his head, feeling a mixture of humiliation and despair take over him. He tried again. "Please, Mr. Daniel, I can fix this. I'll pay for the cleaning. I'll find a way to compensate." "Compensate?" Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter, only scorn. "You thought serving coffee was an easy job, didn't you? And you still managed to mess it up. Tell me, what are you even doing here? Why do you think you deserve to be in this place?" The words cut through Robert like knives. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Daniel wasn't looking for an explanation. He was sentencing him. "You can't stay here," Daniel said, his voice quieter now but laden with certainty. "Not after this." Robert felt the world spin. The voices around him seemed muffled, as if he were trapped in a dark tunnel. All he could see was the fury in Daniel's eyes, the silent condemnation in the faces of the other executives. He knew there was no defense. It didn't matter that it had been an accident. In that room, failure wasn't tolerated. The dismissal was just a matter of time. Then, when everything seemed lost, when Robert already saw himself packing his things and being escorted out, a new voice filled the room. "Enough." The words sliced through the air like a sharp blow. The silence, already crushing, became even heavier. The air grew dense, almost suffocating. All eyes immediately turned toward the direction of the voice. The figure who spoke remained seated at the table, motionless, watching the scene with a sharp gaze. His face showed no anger, but there was something in his presence that commanded absolute respect. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to bang the table. Just existing in that moment was enough to interrupt Daniel and freeze any attempt to continue the humiliation. Daniel immediately shut his mouth, his eyes still burning with rage, his fists clenched at his sides, his chest rising and falling with quickened breath. For the first time since the incident, he was no longer the dominant figure in the room. "This was a mistake," the voice continued, calm and measured, but firm enough to make some of the executives look away. Nothing more. Robert, still trembling, felt the words enter his mind like a shock. He blinked, confused. Did this mean he wasn't doomed? The figure finally moved, leaning slightly forward. "Everyone makes mistakes," he continued. "Or can anyone here say they've never made one?" The silence remained absolute. None of the executives dared to respond. "No one will be fired for this," the figure said, now looking directly at Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened. He didn't accept being confronted, especially not in front of everyone. His mouth opened, ready to protest, but a single look was enough to make him swallow any words he had planned. "He already apologized," the voice added, "and that's enough." The impact was immediate. Daniel seemed unable to believe what he was hearing. His face alternated between disbelief and repressed anger. He looked around, seeking support, but found only executives with closed expressions, avoiding eye contact. He was alone. Or does anyone here think they've never spilled a drop of coffee? The discomfort in the room was palpable. One of the executives cleared his throat, another scratched his eyebrow, but no one dared to speak up. "If we can't understand that mistakes happen, then maybe we're in the wrong place." Daniel gritted his teeth, breathing deeply. His fury had nowhere to go. He couldn't challenge that authority. The figure then leaned back slightly in his chair, speaking more firmly now. "Now go change your shirt and get back to the meeting." The room held its breath for a moment. Daniel didn't move. His pride was fighting against the order. "Or do you want to continue this discussion?" Daniel's breath grew heavy. His eyes, still burning with rage, scanned the room one last time. He knew he had no choice. With one last grunt of frustration, he ran a hand over his face and finally stepped back, turned his back, and left the room. The door shut behind him, and only then did the atmosphere seem to breathe again. Robert still couldn't believe what had just happened. The figure looked at him one more time, now with an evaluative gaze. "Learn from this," he said simply, "and move on." Robert nodded quickly, unable to utter a word. The relief he felt was so deep, he nearly lost his balance. The meeting continued, but nothing would ever be the same. The incident, which could have been the end of his career, became an unforgettable lesson. When the meeting finally ended, Robert remained seated for a moment, absorbing everything that had just happened. The relief still pulsed in his chest, but mixed with it was a deep sense of disbelief. He looked around, seeing the executives leave the room, talking to each other in hushed tones, some still casting furtive glances in his direction. The truth was undeniable. Everyone there had just witnessed something they wouldn't forget. But Robert couldn't just leave without doing something. He needed to thank the man who had defended him. He took a deep breath and stood up, his legs still a little shaky from the nervousness that hadn't fully disappeared. He crossed the room with cautious steps and stopped in front of the man who had stood up for him. "Sir, Robert began hesitantly. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did for me. If it wasn't for your intervention, The man raised his hand, calmly interrupting him. His gaze, which had been hard and imposing before, now carried an unexpected lightness. "You don't need to thank me," he said with a small smile. "You made a mistake. You apologized. That should be enough." Robert lowered his head, not knowing exactly how to respond. "But I never would have imagined that someone in that room would defend me," he admitted, a bit embarrassed. The man chuckled quietly and tilted his head slightly. "You should have," he said, crossing his arms. "You know, Robert, in places like this, many believe that authority is synonymous with intransigence, that leading means imposing fear. But I believe the true power is in understanding people, knowing when to be firm and when to be fair." Robert looked at him attentively, absorbing each word. "Working hard is essential, but no one, absolutely no one, grows without making mistakes," the man continued. "What defines a professional is not never making mistakes, but how they recover from them." Robert nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle within him. "I'll never forget this," he said sincerely. The man smiled slightly and gave him a pat on the shoulder. "Good. But there's something that intrigues me, Robert." Robert blinked, confused. "What? You've been thanking me for minutes, but you haven't asked me who I am," the man said, a playful gleam in his eyes. Robert froze. He didn't know who that man was. His heart skipped a beat, and he felt the embarrassment rise in his face. How hadn't he thought of that before? How could someone of such importance intervene so decisively, and he simply didn't know his name? Well, I thought you were one of the senior executives," Robert said, trying to justify himself. The man laughed. "I'm more than that." He then extended his hand to Robert, his look full of quiet confidence. "Samuel, owner of the company." Robert's stomach dropped. His eyes widened, and he felt the blood drain from his face. "Samuel, the owner of the company? The supreme boss of all those executives? The man who could fire him with a single gesture?" In an instant, Robert stepped back, straightened his posture, and lowered his head in respect. "Sir, I didn't know. I apologize for speaking so informally." Samuel laughed again. "Don't worry," he said, gesturing casually. "I like the way you speak. It means you're not afraid to express yourself, and that's a good thing." Robert remained still, trying to understand if this was a test, if there was a trick behind those words. "Keep doing your best, Robert," Samuel said, starting to walk toward the door. "I like people who work hard. Let's see how far you can go." And with that, he left the room. Robert stood there for a few moments, processing everything. He had just had an informal conversation with the owner of the company, and somehow he left that room with more than just his job intact. He left with a new understanding of what truly mattered. In the following days, the story spread through all the company's departments. Robert noticed it immediately when he started hearing whispers in the hallways, curious glances, and even some muffled laughter from employees who clearly knew what had happened. "So you're the guy who spilled coffee on Daniel?" one of the cleaning crew asked, a mischievous smile on his face. Robert sighed, putting his hands in his pockets. "That's me," the man laughed. "I heard he nearly ate you alive." "It wasn't that bad," Robert replied, looking away. "But it wasn't far off." The story spread like wildfire. Everyone working in that building heard about the day Robert spilled coffee on Daniel and lived to tell the tale. And Daniel? He continued to cross paths with Robert occasionally in the hallways, in the elevators, during some meetings. But he never brought up the subject. His gaze, once full of superiority, was now indifferent, not because he had forgotten, but because there was something he couldn't change. He had lost that day in that room. And Robert? He learned. He learned that mistakes happen. He learned that not every leader is cruel. He learned that an opportunity, even in the darkest moments, can come from where you least expect it. And above all, he learned that sometimes a simple cup of coffee can change everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.